Hey guys, it's Eddie back with Couch Talk. Welcome back to the show. If it's your first time with me, welcome to the show. Guys, please hit like, please hit subscribe, turn your notifications on. I promise if you stick with me, I will earn your viewership. Guys, today I want to talk about the conflict in the Middle East once again, and discuss some of the basics behind it, some of the basic history, some of the basic concepts that have led to this conflict. And I'm going to address some of the ethical concerns because this has turned into a much more politically charged scenario, especially within America, than I originally anticipated. One of the things that I was surprised to see is just how partisan this has become. Because I'm noticing there's this heavy contingent of anti-Zionism on the left that I've been struggling with because I don't not because I don't understand anti-Zionism, but I don't understand why it's left leaning. Like I don't understand why it wouldn't be right leaning also, or not either. I don't understand why being left leaning or right leaning would predispose one toward either Zionism or anti-Zionism. I'm not sure. I guess Israel is a conservative nation state at the moment, and so there could be just an anti-conservative viewpoint that the left-leaning side has that leads them to kind of be, but it doesn't really make much sense because Palestine is also conservative. So I don't know why it would, why one would prefer that to the opposition. But anyway, let's talk about some of the basic history behind this event. And I'm not going to go into too much depth here. If you want a good historical summary, I recommend I can post some links below for some spots that I think do a good job covering the basics. I think Ben Shapiro actually did a decent job, despite the fact that he's obviously pro-Israel and has kind of a bias. But I think he did a relatively decent job of covering the basics. And some other people do a good job too. But suffices to say that this area of the world has been in contention for going on 3,300 years now, right? So one of the first things to note is for those who seem to think that the Israelites only started, laying claim to this land in 1948, you're sadly mistaken. This land has been, their ancestral, at least in their perception, their ancestral birthright for millennia, right? It's been, ever since Moses carried them out of Egypt to the promised land, right? Now, since then, it has never really seen a peaceful era. It's seen some semi-peaceful eras, even like really under the larger empires like the Ottoman Empire, the Roman Empire. But even then, it was still fraught with rebellions. It was fraught with revolts and revolutions and this, that, and the other. The Second Roman Revolution may have led to the downfall of Rome. Like it cost Rome serious resources just to hang on to it. It's been fought for in the Crusades. It's been fought. Literally, people have been fighting over this land for as long as it has as man has existed in this land. So, one of the issues that I would like to talk about today is that where I stand with my take on a lot of foreign policy matters and domestic policy matters for that matter is very much like, where do we go from here? Right? Because one of the temptations I see is to kind of try to turn back the clock to right wrongs, right? That's like one of the things that I see humans try to do all the time. People will say like, okay, well, this happened, this was bad, let's try to go back and fix it or compensate for it, right? A good example is like America and slavery, right? So slavery is obviously a terrible dark mark on American history. And so as a consequence, people want to kind of like turn the clock back and fix it, right? Like by either compensating those who are disenfranchised by it or try to, to mitigate the ripple effects or things like that, right? And that makes perfect sense to an extent. But the problem is, one of the difficulties is where do you draw the line, right? Because if you go back far enough in anyone's history, you eventually run into the situation where all sides of the conflict are in the wrong at some point, right? So like if you go back, in American history, we conquered this land from the Native Americans. You go back before that, the Native Americans conquered land from each other. Americans came largely from Europe. The Europeans conquered each other all over the place. They fought with Africa. Everybody always fights, right? Like the concept that only one group is innocent because they're temporarily the defenders and not the aggressor in the situation is a complex concept, because you go back far enough and eventually they're the aggressor also. They're also the oppressor. So in situations like this, where there's this tension between Israel and Hamas, there's this habit to go back to try to right all of the wrongs, and one could start at any number of places. One could go back to the 6 Day War, where Israel just obliterated everybody, right? And say, oh wow, that was really bad. But then you could go back to before that and say, well, obviously Israel was doing that as a preemptive existential defense, and you'd be like, okay, well then obviously that, and you could just keep going back. So where you stop is very important, right? Often I see people have this temptation to stop right after the part where things started getting bad for them, so that they can be the victim, right? I often see this in American domestic issues, right? Like you want to go back, but you don't want to go back all the way, because if you go back all the way, you have to acknowledge your own cultural history's defects. You want to go back just far enough to demonstrate the other culture's defects, but not back far enough to demonstrate your own, right? And insofar as it goes, I mean, there's something to be said for the more recent situations, right? The more recent circumstances, right? So like if we were to draw this line with the most recent conflict, well, obviously Hamas is the aggressor, right? They're the ones that kind of seemingly out of nowhere started to just, grab women and children and people off the street and take hostages, right? And butcher people and so forth. But of course, if you go back just a little bit further, Israel could be said to be oppressing Hamas in the Gaza Strip for some time, right? And if you go back further, Hamas has in their charter that they want to wipe Israel off the face of the earth. So a certain degree of oppression and control is probably forthcoming if you want to go back. So it just keeps on going back and back and back. So where you draw that line is very important in history. So I say that no line should be drawn. Or if you draw a line, you draw it at the present, right? Here we are. Here's our situation. What's right now? And I know that's not always what people want to hear, right? Like, obviously, if you're the guy who just got punched in the face, you're not feeling like, oh yeah, let's just let bygones be bygones now. I just got punched in the face. I should at least get my punch back and then start, letting bygones be bygones. So it's always hard to be, it's really hard to be the last guy to take a hit, right? It's really hard to be that last nation to be oppressed without that retaliation, without, at least getting at least one last hit in, or going back and, drawing the line where you want it so that you can look like you're the victim and get the support based on that. So it's a complex nightmare, but that's where I stand. I'm the guy, I'm like, well, here's where we are. What is right today? And I think it goes without saying that what's right today is to minimize the loss of civilian casualties, right? To minimize innocent death, and to maximize everyone's safety and well-being. That should be everyone's goal. Of course, it isn't everyone's goal, but that should be everyone's goal, right? Now, so we know that this land's been fought over for forever. You fast forward, several thousand years to like 1880, 1890, turn of the century, the last century, and that's when Zionism begins, because there's a heavy contingent of nationalism that strikes all of the surrounding nations, Russia, Europe, and the Jews find themselves on the receiving end of a lot of anti-Semitic situations. There's all the pogroms in Russia, there's pogroms in across the European front, and between them fleeing that, and of course various other, and then of course the fact that this land was historically something that they had laid claim to at one point in time. This seemed like the time for all the Jews to kind of like amass back in the Holy Land. And this area has a lot of, not only intrinsic value because of its location, its spot on the Mediterranean, which is gorgeous, but also it's got a lot of like this religious value because that's the Holy Land. It's where Jesus was, where Muhammad was. That whole Middle East area is fraught with value, not just physical value, but social value and psychological value, right? So, and one of the interesting elements of this is like, these are not just nations, they're also kind of religions at the same time, which is a weird dynamic that adds an element and adds a new layer of complexity. But so all right, so to get through the history of it, you basically fast forward and the Jews start migrating. They start buying their way in even at the end of the Ottoman Empire. Even though it's a Muslim-controlled territory and they're kind of subordinate, they're able to kind of navigate the corruption of the Ottoman Empire. They're able to buy themselves in. With British rule, British ends up, at one point, the sun never set on the British Empire. They end up owning like the whole universe. They have India and Palestine. They own everything, basically. And so going into World War II, of course, fresh off the Holocaust, the Jews need a place to call their own. Now, at this point, the very controversial decision is made to issue the Jews an official state, right? Now, one thing to note here is that if you look at all the nations on earth, very few nations can make the claim that they were given their country, right? Very few nations have that moral high ground, as it were. America certainly doesn't. We came and we conquered this area. That's how we got it, right? And before that, we were in Europe and we conquered Europe. And before that, literally, the Europeans conquered each other, the Africans conquered each other, the Native Americans conquered each other before we got here. It was conquer, 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 conquer. And again, right, this is like, where do you draw that line? Everybody has conquered everyone. That is not a European trait. It's not an American trait. It's not a Western trait. It is a human trait to conquer, right? Now, I'm not claiming it is a good human trait. It certainly isn't. It usually leads to death and violence and bad things, right? It tears our social... Warfare is horrible. It is just so terrible. I mean, if you guys... literally almost everybody who sees firsthand the horrors of war ends up with PTSD. There are very few things that rip the social and the moral fabric of humans apart greater than warfare, right? So warfare is just, it's a nasty business. Now, that having been said, Israel is one of the few nations in the world that can say, we didn't conquer this land, it was given to us. Now, of course, after it was given, they conquered some other parts, but again, that was in response to existential military threats to them, right? Like literally, 1948 comes by, and the UN issues them a state, kind of going on the premise of the Peel Commission, which was like the two-state solution, right? And they're given a state. So this is like one of the very few nations on earth that can say, hey, listen, we were given this. Those who had the ability and the ownership of this property gave it to us, right? Now, obviously, there was some contention there, but like, let's be real, it wasn't theirs to contend. I get that Palestine wants the area. I get that everybody wants the area, but it wasn't Palestinian rule there. It was British rule, right? So I don't understand where the Palestinian claim to the land comes from, other than they just had a kind of a population majority in the overall area. But it's not like there weren't Jews there. I mean, I think they made up roughly a third of the population or so, maybe a little bit less. But either way, it was. I don't understand where the claim to the land comes from. But almost immediately in 48, after they get it, everybody declares war on Israel, right? Immediately. Just like boom, 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 everybody joins. And of course, they all have their own kind of excuses or reasons, but ultimately, Israel's stuck fighting everyone at once immediately after becoming a nation for its very survival. Now, Israel is historically had a much more potent military, a much more technologically advanced arsenal. So the battles that Palestine has fought against Israel have been dearly fought, unfortunately, and dearly lost, right? And I mean, even today, if you look at the retaliations that Israel launches, they often immediately appear to the most casual observer to be hugely disproportionate. You know, you'll see like one Israelite is captured and killed, and then it's like the next day you wake up and Israel's bombed and blown up, 600 people. And it's like, wow, was that really necessary? But and then the question is, I don't know. I mean, this is the horror of war. If you're in a scenario and you're a nation, right, and other nations want to wipe you off the face of the map, I don't know what the answer is. Like, I don't know how much becomes justified. What I do know is this. What I do know is there are some things that are better than others. And I would always encourage the least amount of war possible, right? Is war always avoidable? I don't think so. I don't think we live in that world. I think there are some times where war is necessary. I don't want it to ever be necessary. I think that if the world functioned as it should, war wouldn't exist. But I think there are sometimes going to be situations where, at least for a defending nation, maybe not for the aggressor, because the aggressor I think always has another alternative, but maybe for the defending nation, there are going to be times where there really is no other option. And if you're a nation and you are attacked, right, remembering that the whole of world history is conquer, 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 and you're a nation and you're attacked, at that point, I have very little sympathy if you cost yourself your sovereignty, right? Like take like America and Mexico, right? We're sitting here side by side. There's no problems between us. There's plenty of friction at times, but there's no real issue that would lead us to war. Now, if America just all of a sudden, if Mexico just all of a sudden just started launching missiles at civilian populations, just out of the blue, the federales just roll across the border and start shooting people. I have very little sympathy for any resultant action that America takes to defend itself. Now, that doesn't mean that America should go stoop to the same level, right? I would never condone America just going out there and targeting civilians, right? I would never want that. I would never even dream of I would think that that's an unthinkable act. But I mean, warfare is terrible. It's just one of those things where sometimes civilians will die, especially in a scenario like the one we're in right now, where Hamas obviously is strategically locating their emplacements in high civilian concentration areas. And they do it on purpose because they know that there's a propaganda battle to win. There's a headline battle to win worldwide. Now, that doesn't make targeting civilian zones correct, right? So it's important to have all these ideas in our heads at once. Just because someone might be justified in taking some extreme measures to defend oneself does not mean that it's the correct decision to make, right? And my general rule of thumb is when it comes to warfare, the act that leads to the least amount of collateral damage, the least amount of human life loss, while still accomplishing the goal. And the goal in this case for Israel would be defense of nation, defense of their citizens. Basically the least amount of life that can accomplish that. Now, how to measure the result of potential action is very, very complicated, right? In eras past, bygone eras, targeting of civilians is just one of those normal warfare operation items. Now, it's not something that I would consider strategically valuable. It's not something that I would ever employ as a nation. It's not something I would ever like to see from anybody, but it's just something that people have always done. And the reason you usually do it is to destroy the morale of your opponent, to place them in a situation where they are cognizant of the fact that should they continue further aggression against you, it will cost them the life of their civilians. Now, that having been said, I don't think that this particular enemy, Hamas, is one that is deterred by that. As a matter of fact, it might even have the opposite effect, right? Like it may even strengthen the regime. It may place, there may be people, citizens of the Gaza Strip that don't really have much skin in the game, right? That are essentially, they're aloof. They're essentially not in this politically charged thing, and then all of a sudden, they lose their family, due to an attack that maybe was necessary, maybe was not, and then of course now they're extremists. So it's one of those things where I think Hamas knows that, and that's why they use that human shielding. So as a consequence, I would think that you would adapt your strategy to accomplish more surgical strikes, but I'm not sure how feasible that is in this situation. It's an extremely complex scenario, and like I said, my stance is this: we are now. Where do we go from here? Now, where we stand at the moment is Hamas has launched an attack, and it's a terrible terrorist action. It's mostly against, civilians. They weren't really fighting military personnel, although they killed some police officers and stuff. And then, of course, the immediate reaction from Israel is that, well, we're going to invade. Now, I don't know that invasion is the right choice. I don't. I don't know that it's the wrong choice either. I can understand that Israel wants to deter this sort of attack in the future. And I can understand that after roughly 70 years of dealing with, attacks back and forth and being having to fight over this land and dealing with an enemy, a group of nations that, for all intents and purposes, literally just will not accept Israel's existence, that they may feel like they have to go through to extreme lengths to secure their safety. Now, I don't know if that's true. I don't. I would think maybe a special forces, intelligence-based strike to round up the leadership of Hamas responsible for this attack might be better, but maybe not. Maybe it's just time to round up every last Hamas insurgent possible and eliminate them. I don't know. I don't know what accomplishes Israel's goals best. I do know that Israel had in the past employed tactics to help minimize civilian casualties, right? They had been in the process of using these roof knockers in the past. That was their standard operating procedure. They'd detonate these large bombs that would basically they were like concussion grenades that would blast over top of a building, make a really loud noise, make it obvious that is where their next strike will land. and then give the building, a few minutes to depart. I've even seen scenarios where Israel will call buildings on the phone and say, hey, like, get your people out of there. And they're like, we don't want to. And Israel's like, yeah, but there's women and children there. Get them out, And they're like, well, if you do this, that'll be a PR victory for us. We'll win the propaganda battle. And it's like, oh my gosh. So if you're dealing with a group of people who wants their civilians to die so that they can garner support in the rest of the world, that is a very complicated scenario. And I don't know what the best way to deal with that is. I'm kind of interested to hear what you guys have to say. What do you guys think Israel should do in this scenario? Because I'm racking my brain for good options, and there really aren't any good options. There's a lot of bad ones, right? I know that there are some things that I feel like just shouldn't ever happen, right? One of the things that I feel like shouldn't ever happen is kind of the way that the Palestinians are being treated overall in the Gaza Strip. I think that over the past 20 years, and maybe rightly so, but maybe wrongly so, Israel's just kind of shifted right to the point where they're no longer really interested in a two-state solution. And that's a fundamental barrier to the peace in that area. Now, the counter-argument, of course, is that Palestine was never interested in that peace, so it's complicated, right? What do you do when you've gone through 50 years of somebody who will not accept your existence? Do you shift your strategy toward, okay, well, if they're not going to let us live, we've got to make sure that they can let us live, and we'll do that any way possible. I don't know. I mean, this is just such a complex scenario, but I see some pieces of both sides of the coin, but I have to say there is not a moral equivalence here. I have to say that Israel came to exist in better than most nations, a manner that is better than most nations. They have largely been the defenders in these encounters, although obviously their responses are disproportionate. I think given the sheer number of Palestinians in the area that at least originally considered Israel an enemy, I don't know. I mean, I don't know how many options. I think they just had a bunch of bad options. I really do. Now, if I could wave the magic wand, right, and make everything the way I think it should be, I would immediately grant Israel a state. I would grant Palestine a state, their own infrastructure so that they can kind of control their own destiny, not so that they're dependent upon Israel for basic sustenance. I would say that Israel and them have to be kind of separated, kind of managed, kind of like kids. Like, all right, put the stick down, stop fighting, go sit in the corner, think about what you've done. I don't know why this area of land is such that it just encourages constant fighting, but I don't like that America wants to get involved every time there's a war anywhere. I really don't like that. I really don't like being the police of the universe. And if we are going to be the police of the universe, we might as well just take the whole zone over, right? If we're going to dominate everyone else's actions, why not just go ahead and be like, all right, you're part of the sovereign America now, pay taxes. I don't understand why we do these half measures. If we're not going to get involved, we shouldn't get involved. If we are going to get involved, we should get involved all the way. I don't understand why we only do this piecemeal stuff. But let me know what you guys think. I think obviously that Israel has to respond to this somehow. I don't know the best way, but I know that there's a lot of bad ways to do it. I think at this point they're basically going to start a ground invasion and go room by room, building by building until they've routed every last Hamas terrorist alive. Every single person who's a jihadist, who's ready to basically claim that Israel shouldn't exist, that they're all infidels and they shouldn't be there. I mean, you just can't work with that. Maybe after those are all gone, Israel can maybe shift toward peace, but I don't know. Boy, I don't know. And meanwhile, we've definitely got to deal with the humanitarian crisis in the Gaza Strip, because it is not helping things, right? Is definitely going to just continue to pressure the Palestinians into this sort of violent resistance, because I don't think that they're seeing much headway in any other method. So let me know what you guys think. I'm looking for solutions. So if somebody has a good solution out there, let me know. I'll catch you guys next time on Couch Talk.